Welcome in. This is Dark Ascent. Today I'm diving into the story of 4 gym guys who thought K2 was being unfairly blamed for mistakes made by weaker climbers. They turned down expert guidance and headed up the mountain, armed with cameras, confidence, and a belief that they already knew enough. They were about to find out that K2 is a very bad place to be wrong. It was August of 2022. K2 rises 28,251 feet along the border of Pakistan and China, making it the second highest mountain on Earth. It is also one of the deadliest. Near the summit, climbers must pass through the bottleneck, a narrow near vertical couloir beneath unstable glacial ice where a single mistake can be fatal. Above 26,000 feet in the death zone, the body can no longer acclimatize or recover. It can only lose strength with every passing hour. At 27, Conan Alderwin was the oldest, a competitive powerlifter from outside Denver, Colorado. He had placed in regional meets twice and built a modest following around his training. He viewed most challenges through a simple lens. If his body was capable of doing something, then the rest was just excuses. His only exposure to the mountains had been a guided hike in Rocky Mountain National Park the previous summer, which he regarded as sufficient preparation for anything that followed. Mivjet Torik, 25, had been Conan's closest friend since high school. They trained at the same gym and shared the same confidence, although Miv expressed his more loudly. He had no climbing background whatsoever and had never needed one to feel certain about his own abilities. In most situations, confidence had carried him far enough that experience seemed optional. Arlo Kashmir, 26, documented nearly every part of his life. Workouts, meals, vacations, recovery sessions. Everything eventually became content. To him, K2 represented less of a mountain and more of an opportunity. He spent months planning camera angles, scouting potential shots from other climbers' footage, and upgrading equipment. By the time the trip began, he had invested more money in filming gear than in the equipment intended to keep him alive on the mountain. The youngest was Caius Gallabrook at 24. He trained harder than anyone else in the group and treated almost every physical challenge as a personal test. Being the youngest bothered him enough that he often pushed himself further simply to avoid appearing weaker than the others. Up to that point, his body had always responded when he demanded more from it. He had never experienced the moment when effort alone stopped being enough. 4 different personalities, but they all seemed to value the same thing, proving they could do hard things. The mountain would challenge that belief in some very unforgiving ways. K2 is harder than Everest by almost every technical measure, despite being nearly 800 feet shorter. The route through the bottleneck is the primary reason. It is a steep, exposed gully of hard ice, approximately 300 feet long, angled at close to 80 degrees in its steepest sections, with a field of glacial seracs, massive, unstable ice towers, hanging above the left side of the route. The traverse above the bottleneck is a near horizontal section of exposed ice leading to the upper snowfields, sitting directly beneath those seracs with no protection from anything that breaks loose above. The death zone above 26,000 feet has roughly 1/3 of the oxygen available at sea level. The body at that altitude is not performing. It is rationing. Every system slows: digestion, cognition, coordination, thermoregulation. The longer a person stays above that threshold without descending, the faster the deterioration compounds. People often compare K2 to Everest because of the height. The difference becomes a lot clearer when you look at the route. August on K2 is the tail end of the climbing season. The summit window narrows as the month progresses and weather systems become less predictable. By mid to late August, most experienced expeditions have either summited or packed out. Base camp population drops significantly, which means fewer people to notice when something goes wrong and fewer resources available when it does. The 4 of them started talking about K2 in the fall of 2021. Conan had come across a short documentary about the mountain and said out loud that the death rate was overstated, that most of the people dying up there were simply not fit enough to be there. The others agreed. By November, it had become a plan. They spent the next 8 months preparing. Conan shifted his training toward endurance, longer sessions, weighted stair climbs, loaded carries up and down parking garage ramps. He started doing 2 workouts a day, several times a week, and tracked every measurable aspect of his conditioning. Miv followed the same routine. Arlo added inclined treadmill sessions and weekend hikes with a weighted pack. Caius pushed harder than all of them. He trained with an elevation mask at the gym, believing it was helping him adapt to high altitude. In reality, it only restricted airflow. Nobody in the group saw a reason to question it. What they didn't do was hire a mountaineering coach or take a technical climbing course. They bought crampons, ice axes, harnesses, and cold weather gear from a reputable outdoor retailer, where a staff member spent nearly an hour explaining the basics. Afterwards, they practiced fitting crampons and handling ice axes in the parking lot outside. Conan walked away, feeling like he had it figured out. Parking lots are good places to learn what equipment does, but they're not particularly good at showing what it feels like to depend on it. Most of their equipment was functional, but much of their clothing was designed for winter training rather than high-altitude expeditions, the sort of gear that works well at a ski resort and struggles on an exposed ridge at -30 degrees. They left emergency oxygen behind because they saw it as unnecessary weight. They skipped an emergency bivouac sack for the same reason. What they did bring was a container of pre-workout powder, figuring it would help keep their energy up during the climb. Proper electrolyte supplements never made the packing list. They booked through a commercial operator, paid for permits and base camp logistics, and declined the guided climbing option entirely. The intake paperwork asked about previous high-altitude experience. Conan listed the Rocky Mountain hike and a ski trip that had reached around 11,000 feet. The others listed similar experience. Nothing was flagged because the form was administrative rather than evaluative. Pakistani regulations required a liaison officer to accompany the expedition, but his role was limited to administrative oversight. Once the climbers left camp, their decisions were their own. When the base camp logistics coordinator later offered to connect them with an experienced high-altitude guide for the summit push, Conan turned it down immediately. As far as he was concerned, they had spent 8 months preparing. They didn't need someone showing them how to climb a mountain. It's hard not to raise an eyebrow at that one. Turning down expertise on K2 is a bold move, especially when you're new to the mountain. They flew into Islamabad in late July of 2022 and reached base camp at approximately 16,900 feet after the standard multi-day approach trek. The approach gave them their first real physical feedback. Miv developed a headache on the second day of the trek that he put down to dehydration and ignored. Caius felt short of breath on the steeper sections and said nothing about it. Conan's pace dropped noticeably on the final approach day, though he pushed through it and arrived at base camp ahead of the others. The standard acclimatization process on K2 usually takes several weeks. Climbers move gradually up the mountain, spending nights at higher camps before descending to recover and repeating the process multiple times. The goal is to give the body time to adapt to progressively lower oxygen levels. Conan looked at that schedule and decided it was more than they needed. Instead, the group completed a single rotation to Camp 2 at roughly 21,000 feet, spent one night there, returned to base camp, rested for 2 days, and planned to go for the summit. Their entire acclimatization period lasted less than a week. While they were at base camp, they met a small team of experienced climbers who were working through their second rotation. Several had already climbed other 8,000-meter peaks. One afternoon, a climber in his late 40s struck up a conversation after noticing the 4 men setting up camp. He asked which expedition they were with and eventually asked about their acclimatization plan. When Conan explained it, the climber frowned. He said one rotation was not enough for K2. He had watched climbers with far more experience run into serious problems above the bottleneck after rushing the process. He also mentioned that the seracs above the traverse looked unstable and that conditions late in the season were not ideal. The climber wasn't trying to scare them or prove a point. He was simply sharing the kind of advice people tend to offer after spending enough time in the mountains. Conan thanked him and said they would keep it in mind. Once the conversation was over, Miv dismissed the warning as the opinion of someone who spent too much time thinking about what could go wrong. Caius agreed. He just happened to say it loud enough for the other camp to hear. The rotation to Camp 2 was more difficult than any of them had expected. Above base camp, the route is not a hiking trail, but a technical glacier approach marked by crevasses, fixed ropes, and long stretches of climbing at altitude. Arlo struggled on the ascent and reached camp nearly 40 minutes behind the others. A cough that had started as a minor irritation during the approach trek was becoming harder to ignore. He blamed the cold air. Caius reached camp without much trouble, but mentioned feeling lightheaded near the top of the climb. He described it as a brief head rush and never brought it up again. Conan and Miv spent most of the night drifting in and out of sleep. Neither woke up feeling rested. They returned to base camp the following day. Conan described the rotation as manageable and argued that 2 days of rest would be enough before a summit attempt. Nobody pushed back. Neither Miv's headaches nor Caius's lightheadedness disappeared completely during the rest period, but neither considered it worth mentioning. By the end of the evening, the plan was set. On the morning they left for the summit push, Miv woke up with a lingering headache. He took a couple of ibuprofen, packed his gear, and kept it to himself. At that point, the summit was finally close enough to feel real. Few people are eager to hit the brakes after coming that far. They left Camp 2 at 11:30 on the night of August 9th. The plan was to reach the bottleneck before dawn, when the colder temperatures kept the ice above it more stable. The temperature at departure was roughly negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit, with moderate wind. In the darkness, the mountain above them was little more than a black outline against a slightly lighter sky. Their headlamps illuminated only a few feet of ice at a time. Everything beyond that disappeared into the dark. The wind never really stopped. It wasn't particularly loud, but it was constant. After the first hour, it became one of those things that was impossible not to notice. The first several hours passed without any major problems. The pace, however, was slower than Conan had expected. The terrain above Camp 3 was more technical than anything they had encountered before. The fixed ropes were manageable, but using them efficiently in the dark, they were in thick gloves. And at altitude, it was another matter entirely. Arlo struggled with his ascender almost immediately. The mechanism was difficult to operate with cold, bulky gloves, and within the first 2 hours he had removed them 3 separate times to make adjustments. His cough had come back as well. It had been easy to ignore at base camp and easier still to explain away at Camp 2, but at this altitude it had a wet, rattling quality to it that was different from before. He said nothing about it and kept climbing. Each time his hands were exposed for somewhere between 30 seconds and a minute. The second time it happened, Caius told him to stop slowing everyone down. The comment seemed to get under his skin. The next time the ascender gave him trouble, Arlo pulled off his gloves and rushed through the adjustment. He put them back on each time without looking at his fingers. Arlo wasn't the first climber to think 30 seconds without gloves wasn't a big deal. At negative 22 degrees, that's a gamble with pretty ugly odds. Caius moved quickly on the fixed lines, pulling himself uphill faster than the others and waiting at anchor points with obvious impatience whenever he had to stop. At one point, he unclipped from the rope entirely on a lower angle section so he could move around a slower climber from another team. The climber immediately told him that was a bad idea and not something he should be doing on that terrain. Caius clipped back in at the next anchor and continued upward without saying a word. By that point, none of the 4 had eaten much of anything since leaving Camp 2. One of the challenges at extreme altitude is that hunger becomes unreliable. People stop feeling hungry and assume their bodies don't need fuel, even when the opposite is true. They had already spent more than 4 hours climbing in severe cold while taking in very few calories. The same problem applied to hydration. Every breath of cold, dry air pulled moisture from their bodies, and none of them had been drinking consistently. The pre-workout powder they had packed, mixed into water bottles that were already beginning to freeze, was the main thing any of them had consumed since the climb began. I think a lot of people underestimate how much eating becomes part of the job on a climb like this. The same goes for drinking, especially when the air is cold enough to hide how much water you're losing. By the time they reached the base of the bottleneck, at roughly 27,200 feet, it was approaching 5 in the morning. Caius had been dealing with the same lightheadedness that had shown up at Camp 2. It had never fully gone away during the rest days, and somewhere above Camp 3, it had become more constant, a persistent unsteadiness that made him fix his eyes on each anchor point rather than think about what it meant. Conan had slowed noticeably over the previous hour. At first glance, it looked like caution. In reality, he was having to focus on things that had seemed automatic earlier in the climb. Every foot placement took more attention. He had stopped making conversation altogether. Miv wasn't doing much talking either. He stayed close behind Conan, breathing heavily as they climbed. It wasn't just the sound of someone working hard. Even when they stopped briefly, his breathing never seemed to settle. Arlo removed his gloves again at the base of the bottleneck to adjust a strap on his pack. With the wind chill, the temperature was below negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. He spent nearly 2 minutes working with bare hands before finally getting the strap secured. When he pulled his gloves back on, his fingers felt thick and strangely unresponsive. He flexed them a few times and continued upward. The bottleneck itself is a steep, narrow gully of ice roughly 300 feet long. In its steepest sections, the angle approaches 80 degrees. The fixed rope running through it is the route. Stepping away from it isn't a shortcut or an alternate line. It's simply taking on a lot more risk for no real gain. They cleared the bottleneck just before 6 in the morning and reached the start of the traverse. This is where the climb began to unravel. Conan stopped at the start of the traverse and did not move for several minutes. He was still on his feet, but he wasn't making any progress. For the past 2 hours, he had been dealing with a severe headache that he hadn't mentioned to anyone. Over the previous 30 minutes, he had also begun struggling with his balance. He had stumbled twice while moving through the bottleneck, catching himself on the fixed rope both times and blaming it on fatigue. By the time he reached the traverse, something more serious was happening. Questions that normally would have gotten an immediate response now seemed to take a few seconds to register. He eventually sat down on the ice at roughly 27,400 feet and said he needed a minute. The words still made sense, but there was something off about the way he spoke. His responses were slower. His speech was slightly slurred. He wasn't being stubborn anymore, and he wasn't choosing to ignore the problem. His brain was swelling from the altitude, and that made it increasingly difficult for him to understand how serious his condition had become. He sat down on the ice and never got back up. All that training had prepared him to keep moving. Knowing when to stop turned out to be the harder skill. Miv's condition had also been getting worse since the bottleneck. At one point, he vomited beside the fixed rope and told nobody about it. His balance had deteriorated as well. He had stumbled twice on the approach to the traverse, catching himself on the rope both times. He wasn't saying much anymore. Most of his attention seemed focused on putting one foot in front of the other. He stayed close to Conan and never left his side. When Caius tried to get Conan back on his feet, Miv was sitting a few feet away on the ice. He was still conscious, but he no longer seemed aware of what was happening around him. The GPS device he was carrying recorded its final movement at 6:41 that morning. Arlo reached them and tried to unclip his camera from the chest harness. His right hand wouldn't cooperate. The fingers moved, but they wouldn't grip. He switched to his left hand and eventually managed it, but that hand wasn't much better. The movements were slower, weaker, and noticeably clumsy. He hadn't felt pain in either hand for over an hour. By that point, the damage was already well beyond the earliest stages of frostbite. Of the four, Caius was still functioning the best. He had a headache and was breathing hard, but he was still thinking clearly and moving normally. He told Conan to get up and keep moving. Conan answered, but the response didn't make much sense. Caius waited a moment and tried again. Nothing changed. For the first time that morning, it was clear that Conan wasn't just tired. By then, there wasn't really a good decision left to make. Staying meant not moving. Moving meant leaving Conan behind. At that point, he and Arlo turned around and started back toward the bottleneck. Arlo could still walk, but managing his equipment had become a problem. He struggled with carabiners, couldn't grip the fixed rope properly, and would have had little chance of stopping himself if he slipped. Caius moved ahead and handled as much of the rope work as he could for both of them. The descent was difficult, even under normal circumstances. With worsening wind, a deteriorating partner, and terrain this steep, the margin for error was almost non-existent. Partway down the bottleneck, Arlo's footwork had become unreliable enough that he was no longer placing his feet cleanly. One of his crampons snagged on the fixed rope. By then, even simple movements were taking more concentration than they should have. He tried to free it, but couldn't manage it with his hands. Moments later, he lost his footing and came off the line. Caius was directly below him. The impact pulled Caius off the route as well. He fell roughly 280 feet down the ice face below the bottleneck before the slope finally eased and brought him to a stop in a shallow depression. He survived the fall, but the injuries were severe. Later examinations found a fractured left fibula and blunt force trauma consistent with multiple broken ribs. He could not stand, and there was no realistic way for him to continue descending on his own. Arlo came to rest about 60 feet above him, caught against a small ice feature on the slope. He had survived too, but both of his hands were effectively unusable. He couldn't rescue himself, and he couldn't get to Caius. The temperature on the slope was below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind had been increasing steadily since early morning. Neither Arlo nor Caius could get themselves to a lower elevation. No other climbers were on that section of the route, and although the group had brought a radio, they had never established a check-in schedule with anyone at base camp before leaving. Nobody was expecting to hear from them at any particular time. At that altitude and in those conditions, hypothermia progresses quickly. Both men were already exhausted, dehydrated, and operating with severely limited oxygen. Without shelter, without the ability to keep moving, and with no realistic prospect of immediate rescue, neither had a meaningful survival window measured in more than a few hours. Arlo's GPS recorded no movement after 7:52 that morning. Caius's device continued to register small positional shifts until approximately 11 o'clock before going still as well. He had survived on the slope for nearly 4 hours after the fall. No distress call was ever made from the group at any point. Back at base camp, nobody immediately realized anything was wrong. There was no scheduled check-in and no confirmed return time. The experienced climbers they had spoken with earlier were the first to raise concerns after noticing the group's absence. The issue was brought to the attention of the base camp coordinator, and a search assessment was initiated on the morning of August 11th. Weather on the 10th made any movement on the upper mountain impossible. High winds and poor visibility above Camp 3 eliminated any realistic chance of reaching the bottleneck area. By the time conditions improved enough for a search team to move, the outcome had already been decided. A two-person team from the experienced expedition reached the bottleneck area on August 12th and located Arlo and Caius on the slope below it. Conan and Miv were found on the traverse above the bottleneck the following day. No recovery of the bodies was possible given the location and conditions. The search team documented the positions, collected the equipment they could safely reach, and descended. Conan Alderwin and Miv Jet Torek were found within 50 feet of each other on the traverse above the bottleneck at approximately 27,400 feet, both in seated positions. Investigators determined that both had died from high-altitude cerebral edema after continuing upward despite progressively worsening neurological symptoms. Contributing factors included the compressed acclimatization schedule, the failure to descend after symptoms appeared, and altitude-related warning signs that had been ignored throughout the climb. Conan's GPS device recorded its final movement at 6:38 on the morning of August 10th. Miv stopped 3 minutes later at 6:41. Time-stamped photographs recovered from Arlo's camera showed both men standing at the base of the bottleneck at 5:15 a.m. Less than 90 minutes before their GPS data went static, Arlo Kashmir was found on the ice face below the bottleneck at approximately 26,800 feet. Investigators determined that he died from hypothermia, an exposure after severe frostbite left both hands effectively unusable. The damage was consistent with repeated periods of unprotected exposure accumulated throughout the climb rather than a single incident. His camera was recovered intact. The final image on the device was a wide shot taken from the base of the bottleneck at 5:22 that morning. Caius Gallabrook was found roughly 60 feet below Arlo on the same slope. Investigators determined that he died from hypothermia and exposure after the fall below the bottleneck left him unable to continue the descent. His injuries included a fractured fibula and multiple broken ribs. GPS data confirmed that his position had not changed after 11 o'clock that morning. No shelter had been deployed. The radio recovered from his pack was still functional and showed no indication that it had ever been used. The permits, GPS tracks, recovered photographs, and equipment were later reviewed by the expedition operator and the relevant mountaineering authority. GPS data showed the group's ascent line deviating from the established route at multiple points, including sections consistent with unroped movement on technical terrain. The four of them came to K2, believing that physical strength could solve most problems. Up there, strength could get you higher. It couldn't always get you back down.